Yes, annually, you know, we make some analysis on what is happening on the M&A global market, specifically focused on startups. And I have the pleasure to share with you the highlights. You should have received the report in your package. Anyway, you can download it from the QR code. And the goal for today is just to give you the headlines of what are the main new things that are coming out from this report, and then to discuss with some, I would say, friends and supporters. You know, this report is a joint venture between MindBridge and Crunchbase, since this is the first years, and is a report that is made possible by the support by Orrick. And so they are with us today, Teare, that is the head of contents of Crunchbase. And then from Orrick, we have Matteo Daste and Richard Smith. Thank you for being here. So we will quickly navigate through the report in order to give you just some basic information, and after we will open up the floor to the discussion. So that's the report. And so this is the fourth time that we run this. And the main typical outcomes of our research work has been, first of all, acquisition are a key component of this ecosystem. The success of Silicon Valley is built upon acquisition. Number two is that there is, as Vivek mentioned before, a big ring to be disrupted, and the only medicine that you can take if you are an established corporate is to buy innovation, and innovation cannot be developed internally, but has to be developed elsewhere, and then you have to just to buy in order to get them fast. And then typically the big dominant player on the M&A market are US companies rather than European ones. That's what we have found in the last few years. What has changed from this view in this New Year report? First of all, what we have done is to dig even more. This year we analyzed 56,000 M&A transactions from the Crunchbase database. We carve out anything that was not startup related. So we reduce down, we narrow the data set to 22,000, that is not a few. And then, as you can see, 19,000 are involving US and European companies. Trends, again, long term is a big word, specifically in a world that is changing every 18 months. But if we look at M&A transaction involving startups since 2010, you can see two things. First of all, there is a growing pattern. And then you can see there are, let's say, at least 4 turning points. First one in 2011, the first big jump. Second one around 2014, 2015. And then the new one has happened, 2016 has been another big jump, and 2017 another big jump. 2018, TechCrunch just published an article quoting our report. They say it's been a flat year. I would say it's mostly a year of consolidation. We will see if that growing trend is about to continue, as I personally believe, or in a certain way we are entering a more mature situation when the trend is going to be flat. We'll see next year. As mentioned, 2018 has not that much grown. US M&A market has grown a bit. Europe has shown a certain slowdown. This is the main evidence that's come from our data. Far East is still difficult to be understood for 2 reasons. Number one, because it's a really dynamic environment, and secondly, because the level of coverage of our data is not that deep in that region, so we need to take any assumption that comes from that region with a bit of caution. You know that US and Europe are mostly 2 continents that have a sort of privileged relationship, and they have a strong preference in working among each other. Though we have seen something compared to last year, that the number of transatlantic deals has shown a certain, has been reduced a bit. How we can interpret this, I don't know. On the one hand, for sure, the European startup ecosystem has matured, and so probably European companies are more looking domestically rather than going outside. On the other hand, probably there could be some early saying of this protectionism scenario that is coming out. We'll see. Another thing to be mirrored. In terms of numbers, US confirmed its dominant role. You see that out of the 18,000 M&A transactions involving US and European companies, you see that the largest amount of them are performed by US companies, both in terms of number of deals and both in terms of deal value. Just a disclaimer, when we're talking about deal value, we refer only to M&A transactions that have a disclosed amount, and technically 15% of our data set. That doesn't mean that our 50% of the reality, because typically small transactions do not disclose amount, while the largest one they do. On the other hand, you can see that it's confirmed the dominant role of Silicon Valley. Again, Silicon Valley almost is a good 60% what the entire European companies is performing. And then another interesting data point is that the US companies are obviously an important buyer on the European market. 27% of M&A transactions are performed by US companies, though this number is declining year over year. Last year was 36%, the year before was about 40%. Another interesting data point, just for you to know, is that the median deal value of US startups, so US startups are acquired for a median amount of 100 million, while European corporates are typically acquired for 30 million. Looks like that European startup is definitely cheaper than US one. This is another analysis that we introduced last year that's quite interesting to understand if it's a sort of balance between buy side and sell side, meaning if you look at an acquisition, there are two sides. There's someone is selling, someone is buying. And if you look at where they are located, you find some interesting data points. Specifically, you see, okay, out of a certain amount of exit, how many has been performed by outside companies, and how much companies that are local are buying outside their own ecosystem. When there is a sort of balance, you can see that we have a sort of a balanced ecosystem. When the situation is, we see below the one, below the parity, it looks like that a circular ecosystem is importing startups, is buying outside more than is producing, while you see something on the top of this graph, you see that the ecosystem is mostly selling startups. What we see from here, you see that US is certainly a balanced situation. So US is producing a number of startups as a nation that's almost similar to the number of startups that are being acquired by US companies, while Europe is producing more startups than the startup that is being acquired by European companies. It's sort of imbalance. They're mostly on the selling side. Israel is specifically a selling nation, meaning that they are producing a lot of startups, but they're definitely selling more than the one that have been acquired by Israeli company. Africa, Middle East, and Latin America is definitely on the net sellers of startups, while Far East is definitely a net acquirers of startups. This is quite an interesting analysis. In the report, you will find analysis breakdown at country level and city level. You see that staying here in the Valley, San Francisco is mostly a net seller of startups, producing more, while obviously there are places like Mountain View and Menlo Park also because they are home for some giants that are definitely buying more than the one they are producing. And then you can see that cities like New York, Atlanta, Chicago are definitely net acquirers of startups. And if you go to Europe, you can find all the data. We also made a sort of ranking in terms of the top acquirers in the world. Just to give you the outcomes of this analysis, it's not a surprise that out of the top 30, 22 are US companies, and 13 are from Silicon Valley. Europe is playing a minor role, Far East is playing a role, a smaller role as well. And then you will find out also, since also we provide data in terms of deal value, we also show also the outliers, meaning the large acquisition for each of the top acquirers in order you can also to understand if the numbers in terms of the value are being driven by some gigantic acquisition. For example, 2016 has been sort of way driven by the acquisition of LinkedIn by Microsoft, for example. And you can find all these things lined up. Industries. You know, as Vivek said, CEO should not sleep at night. It looks like that some of them are still sleeping. Specifically, there are some industries that are not particularly active in acquiring startups. Construction probably is the top one. Insurance is another not particularly active one. Telecom companies are not particularly active. We see definitely more action in the software industry, in the consulting industry that is becoming more and more active in the M&A field, and in the banking sector. In terms of hot vertical for startups, meaning if you want to be acquired, where it should be, again, is difficult when you consolidate numbers because technology are evolving, but you see that beyond software and enterprise software, we see that something is becoming particularly hot in the last 2-3 years, mostly artificial intelligence, big data, and security. Finally, we are able also to define the profile of a startup that makes all its way to the exit. At least if you are a startup, you can know what is typical situation where you typically sell your company as an average. And you can see that mostly the average age at the time of acquisition is something between 5 and 8 years. The average amount of capital raised is something between 20 and 50. In terms of number of employees, at the time of the sale, you are about to 20 to 50, 80 max. And in terms of average ticket price, is something swinging about 50 and 75 million. We also put an interesting analysis, so we were able to cross-reference the data in terms of capital raise and the price that the company has been acquired to see in a certain way what could be the potential return. Results are not exciting on average, because you see, first of all, we're talking about exited startups, meaning startups that made an exit. There are startups that are still up and running, as well as our startups that are crash and burn. And so that is not exactly something that you can reference as an average return of your potential portfolio, but tell you something. First of all, you can see that 59% of the exited startups do not return the capital invested. And 44% are fire sales. So return less than 50% of the capital invested. 70% return between 1 and 3x. That is, 3x is the typical ask for a venture capital fund. And then you see there is a good 15% that are sold at interesting multiple, 3, 10x, and then 8% of what we call the wild ones. That, in a certain way, confirm what is the power law. That meaning that what will make you rich is just a small percentage of your portfolio. Typically 4-8% of your portfolio is the one that are really overperforming. The rest is just something that is not particularly valuable to have around. So that has been the main outcomes of the research. Now I would like to spend some time with our co-panelists.
Tell me when you're ready.
To get some insights. First of all, Genè, you work hard with us to put all these numbers together. What are your takeaways of what we've done?
Sure. So I'm Genè Teare. I'm head of content at Crunchbase. And I just want to congratulate Mind the Bridge that we've worked on this report now for 3 years. And I think every time you re-look at the data, you see some more interesting trends just because you're coming back to it. We provide the data in a digestible format, but it's really Mind the Bridge that is combing through and trying to understand what the data means. And I think there were a couple of things that I would point out in the report. I think the one thing is that M&A activity since 2010 has grown, and specifically in the 2016 and 2017, we saw massive growth by almost 30%. So the fact that the last 12 months, because we do this mid-year to mid-year, there's been a flattening is not concerning, because overall this has been something that we've seen grow quite substantially. So the fact that it's just sort of consolidating or flattening in the last year is a trend that I still think that shows strength. I think one thing we've also seen over doing the report over 3 years is that there is more corporates in Europe who are actively acquiring. So the US acquires two times more startups than the corporates in Europe. I think when we first did the report, and again, the data has gotten better and better, it was closer to the US acquiring almost 3 to 4 times. So we have seen European acquirers or corporates become more active over the last couple of years, which I think is encouraging. I think one of the concerning things for me, just looking at the report, which seems counterintuitive, is the fact that the deal amounts in the last year have gone down by almost 30% or 16 billion. The counts are not massively down, and I think always data comes in after the fact, so those will keep moving up, but the big deals are reported. So the fact that there's a much lower amount in the last 12 months for acquisition of companies who are based in Europe, I think that's a concerning number, and that's definitely something that we're going to watch for the strength of the European ecosystem, and also how that trend persists in the next year.
Focusing on this last thought, again, we have the pleasure of having here both Richard Smith and Matteo Daste from Orrick, that beyond being our sponsor, are the people that are walking the M&A corridors, meaning the ones that are behind the transaction. So, Matteo, what will be your take on what Genè was saying? Is it concerning? Is the fact that the deal value is going down? There is a reason. What's your take about that?
No, thank you, Alberto. I think, the report is probably consistent with the trends. The numbers don't lie. So those trends that we see in the report, I think, are accurate. And it may be that overall the numbers are slightly going down. But I think there are also a couple of other things that are important to point out that don't necessarily appear in the numbers. And that's based on what we see, at least what we've seen in the first few months of this year. I'd say, for example, one trend concerning cross-border acquisitions from US companies into Europe is that we've seen a number of early-stage acqui-hire deals where essentially US companies are looking for European engineering teams for their expertise for products that don't necessarily generate any revenue and they will never go to market, but basically for the brain power that the teams can provide and add to what is being developed by the buyer here in Silicon Valley. And that's a trend that's pretty strong right now between Silicon Valley and Europe. And I think that also has to do with the fact that it's very expensive for companies to do business here. So a lot of the European companies we see, instead of going straight to M&A, oftentimes go to partnership or more strategic deals. And also from a startup standpoint, there is probably less startups from a number standpoint coming here, but higher quality because of the better cost. And then an additional trend that I think goes hand in hand with the report, it's probably true that M&A is being spread more and more globally as opposed to being focused just in the traditional hubs here in the Bay Area. By the same token, we see venture funds investing more and more globally. And ultimately, the venture investing is the driver of where M&A will happen in the next 3 to 5 to 7 years. And definitely, a lot of money is now flowing from Silicon Valley to different parts of the world.
Yes, what you were saying about that, the fact that Silicon Valley is more and more looking outside of the ecosystem is also mirrored by the data. Remember the ratio between the M&A balance ratio. We have seen in just 1 year the numbers going down from 1 to 0.87, meaning that Silicon Valley is definitely more looking outside of the region for M&A targets. And that's something that is pretty in line with what you were just saying. Richard, what are your viewpoint about this?
Well, I think that it is important to keep in mind that the context here, while the study shows a flattening in M&A activity between Europe and here, we are in a very extraordinary period of M&A activity. There's been a global expansion and really an explosion in the last 3 years, and it's not just confined to the companies that are the subject of the study, but it's been a phenomena across industries on a global level. What I do think is worth pointing out is that there are some clouds that may have an impact. It'll be very interesting to see where we are with the study a year from now, and a number of those come to my mind, and I'll just mention a couple. One is that the U.S. government has tightened its regulation of acquisitions by non-U.S. companies of U.S. companies with a particular focus on critical technologies being acquired by non-U.S. buyers. How will that impact acquisition appetite of European companies remains uncertain. We know really of only a couple of very targeted countries, China being one, Russia being another, but I also, just in our work in representing European clients, we know that there are many instances where it's difficult to get European clients' transaction approved under the U.S. national security law. Another area that I think is interesting in that regard is that to the extent that China is no longer really a player in the U.S. market, that may in turn create opportunity for U.S. buyers here because in the recent years, Chinese buyers have been willing to pay substantial premiums for U.S. technology, and to the extent that they're out of that market, while, as Matteo points out, buying companies here is expensive for a lot of reasons. I think that it does stand to reason that there could well be more opportunity for European buyers.
Okay, so that was our snapshot into the world of global M&A. Thank you, Matteo, Richard, and Genè for being with us, and I think it's time for having a coffee.
Yep.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.